Hi, my name is Aminat, and in this video, I will show you how to automate release notes from Zoho Sprint using Anything. This is particularly useful if you're not on a Zoho Sprint premium plan or if you simply want to stop manually compiling release notes at the end of every sprint. Although I'm using Zoho Sprints, you can apply the same approach to any project management tools you use as long as you can retrieve your completed work items, and the workflow is basically almost the same thing regardless. So what I'm trying to do in this tutorial video is at the end of the sprint, I want to be able to get all my completed work items, summarize them and turn them into a user-friendly release notes, convert into a PDF and just send an email to my stakeholders for review and sign off before we actually do release them. Now, I will be using Anything locally with Docker. If you are using Anything Cloud, which is on the direct URL, you can follow along too. If you haven't set up Anything locally and you want to use the local one, I will be providing a link to a video in the description of this YouTube, and it would show you how to install Docker and get everything running. Once your local Anything is up, just keep Docker running throughout the whole process of this video. You can pause the video whenever you need to. You can pause your Docker whenever you need to, but you just have to avoid restarting Docker until you are done. So let's get started. Once you've created your Anything account, sign in using the credentials and you are in. This is what the Anything workspace looks like. I already have a project created, but if you don't, go ahead and create one. As you can see, there's no workflow in this project yet, so I'll create a new one. The first thing is to define what starts the workflow, which is the trigger. For this use case, I want the workflow to run automatically every week, so I'll use the onSchedule node. Next, I would configure the schedule. In my case, I want it to run every 7 days at 9 o'clock. If you are ever unsure about what a field does, you can just hover over the help icon beside it for a quick explanation about what it does. I also want the minutes past 9 o'clock that I want the workflow to trigger. Once you've finished configuring the schedule node, you can go ahead to execute it to make sure everything is working correctly. Now, every time you execute a node, you will get an output. If the execution is successful, like what I have on my screen, you'll see the data returned by that node. You can switch between the different views, right? Depending on which one helps you understand the output better. Now, if the execution actually also fails, you also get the details about what went wrong, so you can proceed to troubleshoot it. Now that the trigger is set up, I'll go back and add the next node in the workflow. But before that, I just want to quickly give this workflow a proper name. I'm going to call it user released automation test because for me, it's actually still a test anyways. Now, this is where it got a little bit tricky for me. Anything has direct integrations with a lot of applications, which actually makes building workflows really easy on it. But unfortunately, Zoho Sprint isn't one of those applications, and that's actually one of the reasons why I'm making this video. Since there's no native or direct integration, the option we have is to use the web APIs. And thankfully for us, Zoho Sprint provides us with public APIs that we can work with. So I'll add an HTTP request node and let's configure it and quickly take a look at what this configuration requires from us, and we'll know what we need. The request method here will be get, because we only plan to retrieve information from Zoho Sprint, not any other thing. Next is the request URL. So for us to get a request URL, that means now is the time for us to go to Zoho Sprint API official documentation, which I will provide you on the screen to check it out yourself. The first request we'll make is to retrieve the active sprint. We need the active sprint ID before we can fetch all the completed work items under that sprint. If you look at the endpoint, you'll notice it contains a few variables, which is the endpoint itself, the team ID, and project ID. Copy the entire URL, replace the endpoints with what I'm providing you on my screen right now. For the team ID and project ID, you can get both directly from your Zoho Sprint board for your project and replace them. Once you replace these values on the URL, it should look similar to what I have pasted here in my own URL on my screen. Copy your full URL and paste it just as I've done in the HTTP node request. Now, the next step is for us to authenticate. Anything needs permission to access our own Zoho Streams data. So we'll set up OAuth 2 authentication. Under authentication, select generic credential type. Then choose OAuth 2 API. When you do that, anything generates a redirect URL automatically. Yours won't be exactly the same as mine, but the formats will definitely be similar. We'll need this in a moment, so let's just keep it in handy and copy it in our clipboard. Now, let's head over to Zoho Developer Console, visit the URL on my screen, and create a new client. When creating the clients, copy the redirect URL from anything, which we have done earlier, and paste it into the appropriate field over here. Once the client has been created, open it and go to the client secret section. You'll find your client ID and your client secret there. I can't show mine because it's sensitive. Then go back to anything. Enter the authorization and access token URLs as shown on my screen right here exactly. Then paste the client ID and the client secret which you've copied, paste it into this relevant field. Next, you need to provide the OAuth scope. Just copy the scope I'm using in this video. I'll also include all these values in a file linked in the description of this video, so you don't have to type everything manually. Once that is done, proceed to save the credential. If everything is configured correctly, the connection should be successful. I would like to rename the credentials to something like Zoho authentication, so it's easy for me to recognize later. Finally, proceed to initiate the connection with the credentials you've saved. And once the connection is successful, you can just close this tab and move on to the next thing. The next step is to specify the query parameters that are required by the API. When you go through the API documentation, you realize that this request requires a few mandatory query parameters. So let's just add them as exactly specified. We'll be adding the index, the range, and also the action. The index and range parameters, see them as how we are able to control how many records are being returned, just like pagination. Although I know sprints can only have one active sprint, but I'm just going to be safe and set the range to 50. Now, on the left-hand side, anything shows the output from previous nodes, which you can reference as inputs for your current node whenever you need to. And on the right-hand side is where the response from the current node would appear. So let's execute this node. Whether the request succeeds or fails, you will always see the response over here. If it's successful, take a moment to inspect the data that comes back and understand its structure. In my case, the main thing I needed was the sprint ID, which is returned in the response here. So at this point, I'm good to go. The next step is to retrieve the work items within the current sprint. And since we already have the sprint ID, we can go back to the API documentation to find out how or what endpoint we'll use to perform the operation to fetch items in a sprint. As you can see, the URL contains a few variables. Replace the API endpoint with what you can see on my screen. However, for the Zoho Sprint team ID and project ID, you can get that on your own. The last variable here is either you have to provide a backlog ID or a sprint ID, and thankfully, we've already retrieved the current sprint ID and we would use that. Now, because the sprint ID changes from sprint to sprint, depending on whichever is active at the moment, we cannot add code that. It's going to be a variable. So instead, we'll use an expression to dynamically pull the sprint ID from the previous node and insert it into the request URL for each time the workflow runs. Finally, just like before, this endpoint expects a number of query parameters. Some are mandatory and while others are optional. So we'll configure only the ones required for our use case, and then we'll see what our request looks like. Now, we would add another HTTP request node. This node is responsible for fetching all the work items within the sprint. Start by pasting the endpoint URL into the request. It should already contain your API endpoint, your team ID, and your project ID. The only value left is the sprint ID, which we know by now would be changing every time. Rather than add coding it, we are going to reference the output from the previous node. Simply drag the sprint ID from the previous node into the URL as an expression. Once you've done that, your request URL should look like this. Next, authenticate anything to access your Zoho Sprint workspace. Select the same authentication settings as I have done on my screen since we've set it up earlier. We'll then add the required query parameters as specified in the API documentation before we execute the node. The node has successfully run, but you will notice that the response contains quite a number of work items for the sprint. However, I'm only interested in the work items that have been completed, as those are what I would need to generate the release notes. If we look through the API documentation for this API, we'll find that the endpoint actually supports filtering by item status. Now we can see that a status value can have 0, which means open items. It can be 1, and it would return the closed items. And if it is 2, it returns items that are currently in progress. And being the fact that I want the items that are closed, I'm going to be using the value of 1. Now let's go back. To do this, we'll have to add a new query parameter called filter and paste in the expression. Just use this expression as it is on my screen, right? For my use case, I'll be setting the value to 1. Let me just expand it so it's easier for you to read and use. Anyways, if your case is different from mine, you can just replace 1 to either 0 or 2, depending on whatever it is that you're interested in. Then let's proceed and execute the node again. This time, you would notice that the number of returned items has somehow reduced than what it was earlier. That's because the API is now returning only the work items that have been completed within the sprint. So at this point, I have a complete list of item IDs, right? And while this is useful, IDs alone do not tell me much. They do not give me information about those items. They do not give me things like title, description, and other information. So let's find a way to be able to get information rather than just ID as a data. API documentation also provides an API for fetching the details of multiple items at once. Unlike the previous API, which only returns the IDs of the item, this API would give us meaningful information about each item, such as the title, the description, and other relevant information. The API structure is what is displayed here on my screen that we will be using. And just as before, you replace the team ID and the project ID placeholders with actual values from your own Zoho Sprint workspace. Next, let's look at the required query parameters. For this request, only one parameter is mandatory, which is action, and its value should be set to multiple details. So let's add another HTTP request node to our workflow. paste the endpoints, the API URL into the request after replacing the necessary IDs, then authenticate with your Zoho Sprint credentials. Now we would add the required query parameters. The first is the action with the value set to multiple details. We're also going to be adding a second parameter called item ID array, ARR basically, which the documentation uses to specify the work items that we want to retrieve their details. Remember that the item IDs are actually dynamic. They need to come from the previous node. So instead of typing it manually, let's just drag the output that contains these IDs and have them inside this expression. So let's execute the request. At this point, we are getting a 400 error, which is like a bad request. So let's look at the response, and it says an extra parameter was found. Okay, the issue here is that the item IDs weren't passed in the format that the API is expecting. The expression we dragged is not being interpreted correctly, right? It's expected to get it as a string, an array string. To fix this, we'll have to replace it with this new expression you can see on my screen. All we're doing is we are converting the array of item IDs into a properly formatted JSON string, which is what our endpoint expects. So let's execute the code again. This time, the request actually succeeded. If you inspect the response, you'd see that we are getting not just a list of IDs. We now have the complete details for each of these work items, including their title, description, and all those other things. And this is exactly what we will need in our next step in summarizing and generating a release note automatically. So before we actually pass this into AI to summarize, let's actually clean this data so it's well structured. And we can do that with just a few lines of JavaScript. So before writing the code anyways, let's take a moment to rename our nodes in this workflow. It's a good practice. So let's just do that, especially because the workflow can actually grow larger, and meaningful names make it much easier to understand if we have to maintain the workflow later on. So now let's add a new node that undo the code, and it will help us transform the data into a much cleaner format. We'll be using JavaScript, so not Python. So let's replace the default code with what we have on my screen here. I'll also include the complete code, which is this script, in the description of the video, so you can copy and use it directly. Once this is done, we can execute the node. Now compare the output of what we had earlier. This is much cleaner and easier to read. At this point, we have everything that we need from Zoho Sprint. Our work is completed. The only thing left is turning these completed work items information that we have into release notes that someone can be presented with and they can read it. So rather than writing those manually every sprint, right, we'll have AI to help do the heavy lifting. So let's add an AI agent node. We're not building a chatbot, so we do not need to have a chat trigger. So instead, we'll be providing the prompt ourselves. The AI agent has two important sections: the system message and also the user message. Now, the system message is expected to be able to help the AI to define its role and how it behaves. In my case, I want it to always act as a product release notes assistant. So I have included instructions on how it should rewrite work items, avoid anything that is technical jargon as much as possible, and just help produce a customer-friendly release note. I'll include the full prompt of this in the description so you can use it and modify it however it is that you like for your own scenario. The user message is actually much more simpler. Its purpose is to simplify and tell the AI what to do with the data it is receiving. In this case, we're asking it to generate the release notes for the active sprint using the work items we've just prepared. I'll include this prompt in the description as well. So let's just execute the node. As you can see, it fails. And this is expected because every AI agent in anything requires a connected LLM, like a chat model. Think of the AI agents as sort of a coordinator, while the LLM, which is the language model, is actually what generates the response. The AI agent's job is to get information and input it into the LLM as anybody would and generate a response. So let's fix this and connect the LLM, which is the chat model. Now, there are several LLM providers available, but for me, I'd rather use Grok because to start with, it's free and it's effective in a way. So we'll need to create a Grok API key so that we are authenticated. If you don't have an account, you will have to create an account. You can do that on their website on my screen, and you can access your API key. And once you created your account, generate your API key and provide it as a credential in anything. Next, select the model you would like to use. I'm using the one shown on my screen, but you can choose any other that is supported if you prefer. Now let's execute the workflow again. And this time it is successful. If you look at the output, you would see that the AI has generated a complete set of release notes in plain text from the work items, including an overview of the sprint, and it is actually customer friendly. Now, the final step is presenting this release notes as an artifact in a document. So I'm going to be using Google Docs, and to add a Google Doc node, I have to specify I want to create a document. Then this will create a new document for every release, giving us a dedicated document for each release. If you prefer another document platform such as Zoho Writer, you can use that instead. But overall, the approach is actually still the same thing. Again, before anything can create documents in our Google Drive, we need to grant it permission. To do that, we'll first set up Google Docs credentials. Start by copying the redirect URL shown in the credential setup window. We'll need it shortly. The next thing we need is a client ID and client secret, which we would generate from the Google Developer Console. You can use the URL on my screen to get there. Once you're in the console, either create a new project or use an existing one. I'll create a new project for this demonstration. Fill in the project details, create it, and wait for it to finish provisioning. Once it's ready, and you can see it's ready, just make sure you've selected the newly created project before continuing. Then you navigate to APIs and services, select credentials, click configure consent screen, then click on get started, fill in the required information, and just complete the setup. Once this is all done, return to the credentials page and click create credentials. Then select OAuth client ID. For the application type, choose web application. Give your client a name. For the homepage URL, enter the URL where your Anything instance is running. In my case, since I'm using Anything locally, I'll just use my localhost URL. For the authorized redirect URL, simply paste the redirect URL that we've copied earlier from Anything and then create the client. Google will now provide you your client ID and client secret. Copy the both of them into Anything. I'd recommend downloading the credentials for safekeeping because it's much easier for us to use them later on when we need it for other setup. Now, before we can sign in, there's one more thing we have to do. Since the application is still in testing mode, only approved users can authorize it. So I'll just navigate to audience, click add users, enter the email address of the Google account that should access this application, and then save the changes. Now we will return to anything. Paste the client ID and client secret into this configuration settings, save the credentials, and click sign in with Google. Just complete the Google sign in prompt, and once everything is successful, your Google account will be connected to anything. And let's test it. Execute the node, an error is returned. Reading through the error message, we can see it's actually a permission issue. The message provides a link to the API that needs to be enabled. So I'll copy the URL and open it. As expected, the API hasn't been enabled for this project yet. So I'm just going to enable it now. Once that is done, head back to anything and refresh the page. After refreshing, you'll notice that the previously empty drop-downs are now populated with your Google Drive resources. I'll choose a folder from my Google Drive because I would like every release notes created by this workflow to be stored in a single location. Now, I've already created a folder specifically for this. You can do yours also. Next is I'll give each document a title. To make each release note easy to identify, I'm going to include today's date in the document title using the JavaScript expression shown in my screen. That way, every document created by the workflow has a unique and meaningful name. Now let's execute the node again, and this time it is successful. If I open my Google Drive and navigate to the folder I selected earlier, I can see that a new Google document has actually been created automatically. However, when I open the document, it's empty, and that's actually expected because the node only just creates a document. It doesn't update the document. It doesn't do anything else aside from that. So to populate the document with our release notes from the AI, we have to add another Google Docs node, and this time the operation would be to update an existing document. The first thing this node needs to know is what document is it updating. Since a new document is created every time the workflow runs, we can't add code the document ID. Fortunately, the previous Google Docs node returns the ID of every document it creates, and we are going to use that. So open the output of the previous Google Docs node and drag the document ID into the corresponding field in this node. This tells anything to always update the document that was just created in the current workflow execution. So let's try executing the node again. And we got an error. Okay. The reason is simple. We have told anything which document to update, but we haven't told it what content it is putting inside that document. The content we want is the release node generated by our AI agent. So let's open up our AI agent node, drag the output into the contents field for this Google Docs node. And at this point, the node knows which document it is updating and what content it is inserting inside that document. So let's execute this again. And yeah, this time the operation completes successfully. And if we open the Google document that was created earlier, we can now see that it has now populated with the release notes that are AI generated. Each time the workflow runs, a new document will be created. It will be filled with a release note from the AI for actions, for items that has been completed for that sprint. Now that we have the release note as a document, the whole point of this workflow is automation. The people who need these release notes shouldn't have to come to my Google Drive every week to look for them. Instead, we'll have the workflow delivered to them automatically. The first step is to convert the Google document into a PDF. To do that, we will need to add a Google Drive node and choose the download file operation. This node needs to know which file it is downloading, and since the document was just created in the previous Google Docs node, we can just simply drag the document ID from that node into this one. Thereby, we've specified what file it is downloading. Next, we need to authenticate anything with Google Drive. We'll use the same client ID and client secret we created earlier on the developer console for Google. If you downloaded the credentials, that's perfect. Just copy the information and paste them into anything. Save the credentials, click sign in with Google, and complete the authorization process. Once the connection is successful, we can configure how we want the file to be downloaded. So since our file is a Google document, I'll choose PDF because that's what I prefer. Let's execute the node. And this is successful. The workflow has now converted the Google document into a PDF. If I open the downloaded file, I can confirm that it contains the release notes exactly as expected. The only thing left now is getting these documents to the people that actually need it. For that, I'll use Gmail node, right? If your organization uses a different email provider, such as Zoho, email, or Outlook, you can just replace this node with a corresponding one. That is, if anything supports it. So I'll add a Gmail node, choose the send email operation. I'll specify the recipient's email address, which is my email address for now, then enter a subject. So to make each email easy to distinguish, I'll include today's date in the subject using the expression shown on my screen. Next, I would write the email body. This is the message recipients will receive when they open the email. You can keep it simple or style it however you want. I'll just make a few adjustments to both the subject and the email body before continuing. Now, let's attach the PDF. The Google Drive node outputs the downloaded file as a binary data. So we would use the data binary as the attachment as it is. Let's execute the node, and we got an error. Okay, looking at the message, it's because we haven't configured Gmail credentials yet. Just like before, we'll create a new credential using the Google OAuth client ID and client secret from the developer console. Save the credential, click to sign in with Google, complete the authorization process, and return back to the node and execute it again. This time, another error actually appears. The message indicates that the required Google API hasn't been enabled for this project. So it provides us a link, so I'll just copy it, open it up in my browser, and enable the required API in the Cloud Console. After enabling it, I return to anything and execute the code once again, and it's successful. The email has now been sent. As you can see on my screen right here, this is what I got with the PDF attachment containing the generated release notes. And I'm not particularly happy with how the message body of this email looks like, right? It's not polished. So instead, I'm going to switch the email body to HTML from text, which gives us more control over the formatting and styling. I've prepared an HTML template, and I'll include it in the video description so you can use or customize it for your own workflow. If I send the email again, the difference is immediately noticeable. The email now looks cleaner, more professional, and presents the release notes in a way that's much more suitable for stakeholders and clients. And that's it. One final thing to note is that this setup is running locally using Docker. If you are also using anything local and not online, so the workflow will only run while Docker is active. So for a production setup, you need to host your anything instance in the cloud. I didn't cover that in this video, but I'm hoping to do a part 2 where we are able to deploy our Anything instance to the cloud and update necessary URLs or configurations where needed. If you can't wait for the part 2, or if I do not make the part 2, you can follow anything cloud hosting tutorial, watch the video, and once you host your anything, simply replace every local host URL we used throughout this workflow with your hosted anything URL. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I see you in the next one.